be ready, right? Yeah. So we're going to start. We are live streaming this evening's presentation. And so while you can speak to people directly here, George, and you'll see the faces, some faces that you know, we have an audience elsewhere as well. My name is Liz Plater-Zyberk, and I am the faculty member of the School of Architecture who has been charged with coordinating the Vincent Scully Seminar. Many of you know this already, but for the purposes of those who might not, I'll just say a few words about the intentions of the school to run a seminar that calling upon the inspired teachings and writings of Vincent Scully, who we remembered in a ceremony last week. This seminar will bring visiting designers and writers to the school to work with the students and to lecture to our audience of faculty and people in the community. And so I think you know you've seen the poster. This year's speakers are Alastair Gordon. We had a wonderful series from Alastair. George Baird, who's starting his 3 lectures this evening, and we will still look forward to Neil Brenner later this spring. George Baird is the founding principal of Baird, Sampson, Neuer Architects. He has a design oeuvre that ranges across architecture, urban design, public space, and preservation projects. His illustrious career has been recognized in many ways over the years, but he pointed out to me, as it's easy enough to find also in researching you, George, that his recognition with a gold medal from the Royal Architects Institute of Canada and the Topaz Medal given by the ACSA and the AIA, both distinguished recognitions. The Topaz for a teaching career, the Royal Medal, the gold medal, I presume, is usually given to practitioners, and that as far as he knows, he's the only person in history to have received both. What that represents is that he has been crossing the border frequently to be teaching not only at the University of Toronto, but also at Harvard. And of course, the ACSA stretches across the North American borders. That's the Association of Collegiate Schools of Architecture. In many ways, Mr. Baird is an incredible role model for our students. You might all look forward to be thinking about different ways that you be engaged with architecture, and certainly professional practice is probably what most of our students are looking forward to, but some of you might be thinking about also having a teaching career, and of course, research and writing, which is one of the topics of this seminar. So Baird's publications include a number of books and articles, including in 1969, collaborating with Charles Jenks on meaning in architecture. More recently, Public Space, Cultural Political Theory, Street Photography 2011, which I understand the Dean has asked you to refer to during your visit. But I think most interestingly, if you look at that trajectory, it represents a very interesting time in history, which I think many of us understood in rethinking the influence of Vincent Scully to be a very important time in which architecture renewed its interest or its recognition of its professional history, of its design history. In the first years of architects struggling with how to incorporate that history with the modernism that everyone was committed to and very excited about. and how that grew into interests, the broader interests of urbanism in cities as a kind of continuous trajectory. I'm not sure you would call that the trajectory of postmodernism, but certainly it's a familiar continuity, I think, for many of us. And you have contributed tremendously through practice, teaching, and writing, and we look forward to hearing about that. Please help me welcome George Baird.
Oh, yes, the water. Thank you. Thank you, Liz. This is going to be a curious event in a number of respects, since I don't normally do talks that have to do with things I've already published. But Dean El-Khoury insisted that he wanted me to do this public space presentation. And since he was the one who invited me to come, I agreed to his request. The second thing, which is a bit curious about it, is that those of you in the room that are the students have already been through this material anyway, so we'll see how much more you get out of my actually presenting it to you directly. I hope it's something. The last thing I have to say is that Elizabeth Platter-Zyberg has been a gracious host, and of course one of the kind of sort of embarrassing dimensions of that is that this book starts out with a critical commentary on an image of one of their early projects. So her hospitality even has to be described, among other things, as extraordinarily magnanimous. So thank you for that. She also made a request of me that I didn't expect, and so I'll deal with that now. And that is, she thought it might be appropriate for the students, at least, for me to say a few words about how I got to where I am. I'm a Canadian, I'm a Torontonian. I joke, those of you that have any familiarity with my city, Toronto, will know that it's famous now in the world as a city of immigrants. Over half the population of Toronto was born outside of Canada. It's we think we're the world capital of multiculturalism. Anyway, I was actually born in Toronto. I'm one of the few that's actually from the place, from birth. So I grew up there. I went to the architecture school in my hometown, which was an okay school, but not a great school. After I graduated, I worked for an interesting architect who's still alive and whom I admired and still admire a lot, although he's now retired, being 88 years old. But I was intellectually restless about my education. This is my Bachelor of Architecture education was 1957 to 62, so this is a while ago in the kind of sort of window of evolution. It was the period before the kind of questioning of orthodox modernism actually got going. And I suppose my intellectual restlessness was something to do with a certain dissatisfaction on my part with the orthodoxy of orthodox modernism. So after working for my mentor, Jerome Markson, for a couple of years, I very happily, it was nothing wrong with his office, I was fortunate enough to receive a British Council scholarship. The Commonwealth used to be a more formidable political entity than it has recently become. And so it was easy for Canadian students, well, relatively easy for Canadian students to get funded to go and study in Britain. And so that's what I did. So I spent the years from 1964 to 1967 in London, England, studying at the Bartlett School. And I have to tell you, I thought I was a reasonably sophisticated young person, but in London, I discovered I had no idea what I was getting into. London was absolutely fever pitch ferment. The Smithsons were the major luminaries of the older generation, but were being upstaged at the Architectural Association by a younger group called Archigram. Cedric Price was kind of sort of rampaging around London, taking swipes at all of the older generation people and organizing a kind of uneasy alliance with the Archigram group. Meanwhile, figures like James Sterling, Kenneth Frampton were leading figures in architectural education and publishing in London at the time. And I actually got to meet them all and actually to become friends with them all. In fact, I can a little nod to Kenneth Frampton. I couldn't do the presentation I'm going to do for you tonight, which will focus in substantial measure on the political theory of this interesting German-American philosopher called Hannah Arendt. Kenneth says that Kenneth and I are the two people in the world of architecture that have had a kind of sustained interest in the work of Arendt over an extended period of time. Our interests aren't perfectly convergent, but there's a lot in common between us. And Kenneth can remember why he first read Hannah Arendt, and the mutual friend of his and mine, whom Kenneth says told him to read her. And so I went home after Kenneth told me this. I went home and opened up my dog-eared paperback copy of The Human Condition, only to discover that inside I had written London, 1965, which leads me to suspect that, like Kenneth, I was told to read Arendt by this person his name was Sam Stevens. He was another one of the London luminaries who has not gone down in history with quite the same degree of fame as most of his contemporaries have done. But anyway, it was Sam who introduced me to Hannah Arendt, and I'll be talking to you about her when I get into the substance of my presentation. I came back from London in I was afraid if I stayed in London, I would become a pure academic, and I wanted to practice. So I came back to Toronto in 1967 with a view to becoming a practitioner, but I thought some part-time teaching might keep the wolf away from my door. And in fact, what turned out not to be easy, but I did eventually get a teaching position, actually through the intervention of Aldo van Eyck, of all things. Aldo van Eyck had been in London. Charles and I, as Liz had mentioned in her introduction, had together published a book called Meaning in Architecture, which I think we can probably reasonably say is kind of the beginning of what we now know as architectural theory, at least in the Anglo-American world. There was certainly something you could call architectural theory in Europe prior to that, in Spain and in Italy and a little bit in France. But in the English-speaking world, Meaning in Architecture really starts it off. And Aldo van Eyck was one of the contributors to it, and he liked the book, and so he helped me to get my first teaching job in my own old school in Toronto. And so I started a small practice. My practice sort of grew. It was very strange. We had a municipal political rebellion of the population against overdevelopment in the early years of my practice, and I ended up doing a major urban design study for the city, and the reason I got that commission was largely because I was one of the few architects in town that was not known to be working for developers. It was very paradoxical. So that was the beginning of my kind of urban design career. So I had a kind of mixed career of teaching and practicing. Peter Eisenman, in those years was running the Institute for Architecture and Urban Studies in New York, and I was not a regular, but an occasional visitor to the Institute for kind of events there, which sort of kept me in a kind of more international loop than was possible in Toronto. And then through some stormy years at the University of Toronto, which I won't bore you with, I ended up in 1993 accepting a position on the faculty of the Graduate School of Design at Harvard. And so I joke about Harvard that Harvard isn't really in the United States. It kind of sort of hovers somewhere above the United States. It's in the Northeast, but it's not actually, it doesn't actually touch the ground. So I actually commuted to Boston from Toronto. It's an hour flight, so it's not a big deal, for 11 years as a tenured faculty member there. And had my eyes opened up all over again to the larger possibility. Harvard, as you probably know, has more guest critics teaching studios than any other architecture school in the world on account of their rather generous financial circumstances. In 2004, I was invited to come back to the University of Toronto as the dean, and so I ran the Toronto School for 5 years and then retired in 2009. I didn't actually stop teaching then. My successor, Richard Summer, who had been junior faculty at Harvard when I was there, invited me to come back to teach, and I've been teaching there ever since. I enjoy teaching. I joke that I'm back in fashion with the students, so I'm a popular teacher, and that's my little vita for those of you that were curious. Now, public space. I got frustrated in some years back at the status of discussion about public space. I've already made the remark about the image of Seaside that is toward the beginning of the book. I might also refer to the work of the Creer brothers that in whose work I had actually a fair degree of interest, at least some of whose work, but which for my money came to be kind of too historical, especially progressively so over time. So I was ill at ease with that, but as if that weren't enough, I was even more troubled by the stance of what I've called the kind of the neo-avant-garde. I'm thinking of people like Aaron Betsky, who actually wrote a book called, something Flowers, against public space, as though public space was a bad idea. Michael Sorkin published a book called, referring to theme parks and, quote, the end of public space. And it's, so there was on the kind of intellectual left, there was a kind of sort of radical loss of confidence in the idea of public space even being a kind of real possibility in the contemporary world, which struck me as kind of ridiculous. I mean, I understood some of the nature of the critique. They were worried about commercialization of public space. They were worried about gentrification. They were worried about social exclusion in putatively public spaces, and all of these, of course, are real issues, no doubt about that. But it seemed to me kind of preposterous to kind of proceed from concerns about those kinds of circumstances to disparaging the whole idea of the existence of public space tout court. So, and I mean, I remember, in fact, in the book, I make reference to places where there's clearly kind of active public life in the street. Miami's not on my list because I didn't know the city that well at the time. But I even mentioned Houston because, of course, if you're talking about bad American cities, Houston is one that often comes up on a list. And there are parts of Houston that are pretty urbane. I mean, not too many, I admit, but there are, even in Houston, you can find urbanity. It's not impossible. You can certainly find it in Toronto. And in fact, in the run-up to kind of preparing this book, I remember taking a trip. I was actually I was invited to be on an urban design awards jury at Harvard, and we were flying to Mexico City to look at some projects of the Mexican landscape architect Mario Chetnan, and so I had to get myself from Toronto to Mexico City for this purpose. And around the same time, I was asked to participate by the Department of External Affairs in Canada, a federal government department, to participate in a kind of export of professional services meeting at a hotel in Houston. Don't ask me why I agreed to go to such a meeting. It was a total waste of time, but in any event, so I went, and the meeting was held in the Four Seasons Hotel, which is in downtown Houston, but right on one edge of the downtown. And I remember this extremely curious experience. I was there I arrived one evening. I stayed overnight. The next day was all the meetings with these salesmen, hustlers, kind of, operating in all this strange world of pure business. And then to bed again, and then the next morning I was going to go to the airport to complete my journey from Houston on to Mexico City. And so I remember getting up early and going out into the street outside the hotel and noticing that there weren't any people in the street. And so I sort of went out across the street to the opposite sidewalk where I could get a long view. It was on the edge of downtown Houston, which, as you know, is a grid. So I looked as far as I could see down the street, not a single person in sight at like 7:45 in the morning. So I thought, and it was the edge of downtown, that much was clear, because on the other side around the hotel was all parking lots. So I went to the intersection to be able to look down a cross street, an intersecting street, into the center of the downtown, and look down that street. And there again, I couldn't see a single person. It was the strangest experience. In any event, so I went back to the hotel. They got me a cab to take me to the airport, and I flew to Mexico City. Houston to Mexico City is like not a long flight, hour and a half, 2 hours, something like that. And I land in Mexico City. I get in a cab to go to my hotel. Well, so many pedestrians, they won't fit on the public sidewalks. Cooking, serving food, selling food on the sidewalk. I still remember when we got to one of the round points on the Paseo de la Reforma. There was heavy vehicular traffic along with all this pedestrian activity. My cab got into a line, and they had a complicated system of traffic signals to control movements into this circular traffic device. And so we were up against red lights to stop while traffic on some of the other spokes of the wheel was moving through it. And while we were doing that, I could see at the front of the line of vehicles, of which my cab was one, a troupe of jugglers appeared in the pedestrian crosswalk and put on a performance of juggling and standing on one another's shoulders and throwing balls into the air and so forth, which lasted exactly as long as the traffic signal took before it turned to green, at which point they would kind of disassemble themselves rapidly, and two or three of them, the youngest ones amongst them, would run down the rows of stopped vehicles collecting contributions for this spontaneous performance. Meanwhile, the other members of the troupe were actually organizing themselves in the next spoke of the wheel over, which by this point had turned to red because ours was now green, and they were starting the whole process all over again in the next arm of the arc. Well, I thought, public life in the city, take that, Michael Sorkin, Mike Davis, Aaron Betsky. So I decided I was going to do something about public space. And I had already been interested in the political theory of Hannah Arendt, and I'd read a little bit of Jürgen Habermas. And out of my kind of feeling that this bias or this kind of strange debate about public space and whether it existed or not, which seemed to me largely preposterous, combined with my interest in political theory, inclined me to put this set of arguments together. So that's what I did. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to just talk a little bit about the three, two political theorists, one cultural theorist, that whose ideas I worked with in order to put this together. Those being, of course, Arendt, Habermas, and Walter Benjamin, and those, of course, are the people whose readings I actually suggested to the students in the group tonight. So those of you that are familiar with Arendt will know that there are two sort of sets of terms which are sort of fundamental for her, and one is a binary pair and the other one is a triad. So the binary pair is public and private, and a host of her theorizing propositions actually revolve around the distinction between the public and the private, and it is in respect to their opposition to one another that her ideas of what the public actually is become so important. The triad has to do with the terms labor, work, and action. Labor and work, by the way, are the two terms in Arendt that have been so significant in the work of Kenneth Frampton. So Ken has actually focused especially on those terms in her. She was a student of Heidegger, and she learned about etymology from Heidegger, among other things. And her interest in etymological constructs as a kind of route to intellectual understanding of theoretical ideas and philosophy is itself significant. So labor for her has to do with the daily biological cycle of existence. In crude terms, I work enough to earn enough, to eat enough, to be able to work enough, to earn enough, to eat enough. So this is the biological cycle of existence in a fairly kind of fundamental way. Everybody is everyone. Animal laborans is the Latin term she uses to describe, man as the laboring animal. And everyone is a laboring animal. None of us is exempt from the biological cycle of existence. Then there is work, and work is actually the process in which some of us engage some of the time, which produces artifacts which have some degree of durability and may even have sufficient durability actually to last longer than we ourselves will last in the world. And of course, the world, which for Arendt is a phenomenological construct, the world is, among other things, the product of the processes of work in which men and women participate. Action is the highest category of human experience altogether, and here it's worth reading it. The revelatory quality of speech and action comes to the fore where people are with others and neither for nor against them. That is in sheer human togetherness. Because of its inherent tendency to disclose the agent together with the act, action needs for its full appearance the shining brightness which we once called glory and which is possible only in the public realm. Another part of Arendt's phenomenology has to do with we really only find out who we are ourselves in interaction with our peers because our sense of ourselves is in part a kind of function of our peers' sense of us, which we learn of back from them. So, so this kind of togetherness is actually important even for a kind of an individual's understanding of his or her selfhood. So action is in this hierarchy, labor, work, and action. It's the kind of ultimate human experience, if you like. So that's a quick little summary of the premises of Arendt in which I was interested. Habermas wrote a famous book called The Structural Transformation of the Public Sphere. He wrote it in 1960, which is 2 years after Hannah Arendt wrote her most important book called The Human Condition. For those of you that don't know much about Arendt, be assured that Eichmann in Jerusalem is not her most important book. It's her most famous book. You might even say her most notorious book, but it is far and away not her most important book. The Human Condition is the one that occupies that space. And the quotations I've cited all come from it. Habermas is, of course, among other things, influenced by Arendt, and his great contribution is to come up with this concept called the public sphere, which he thinks is an invention of the 18th century, 17th, 18th century, principally in Britain and in France, having to do with debating societies, coffee houses, clubs. It has to do with the emergent bourgeoisie in a variety of European countries, and citizenry finding ways to sort of come together for discussions with one another, and it then eventually leads to the creation of journals and newspapers, and to a kind of political discourse, which is a common one, and that all adds up to what Habermas calls the public sphere, and it has been a useful and quite influential intellectual construct. A number of younger generation critics, younger than Habermas anyway, were critical of Habermas's conception of the public sphere because they thought it was too male. It didn't have enough women in it. It was too unified. It didn't allow enough for kind of conditions of difference. And that it was really kind of elitist. And so a whole set of subsequent critiques of Habermas's theorizing were formulated and published along those lines. And in this text of Nancy Fraser's, the essay called A Critique of Actually Existing Democracy, Fraser, it's a remarkable essay actually, which is why I put it on my reading list, because on the one hand, it accepts in a substantial measure these various critiques of Habermas, but it then goes on to actually elaborate dimensions of the Habermasian construct, notwithstanding the critiques, in a way which I argue in my text is actually rather Habermasian. And she, in response to this idea of the kind of excessive unification of Habermas's idea of the public sphere, she comes up with the proposition of multiple publics. And then, of course, among the multiple publics, they don't necessarily all agree with one another about, what political priorities should be, which actually then leads her to the construct of a counterpublic. And then, as if that isn't enough, she then goes on to actually invent this remarkable phrase, subaltern counterpublics. Subaltern counterpublics are groups which see themselves as being identified as not only as not part of the public at large, but actually of being in a condition of some degree of oppression by the public at large. So this is a little bit historically passé now, but gay rights groups would according to Fraser, would identify as subaltern counterpublics. She also introduces the wonderful phrase publicist, because she was arguing that one of the political interests of subaltern counterpublics is to put pressure on the public at large in order to rethink its position in relation to the status of those very subaltern counterpublics which exist and which are in some degree or other oppressed. So I found the whole construct of Fraser's argument quite fascinating. Then my third thinker is Walter Benjamin, and he, of course, is, at least in my career, he was much written about. Arendt and Habermas were not, Benjamin was. And what I got fascinated by in Benjamin was these pair of phrases, and here again I will quote. It's from Benjamin that I extract the construct of, quote, distraction. Here we go, quoting. Distraction and concentration form polar opposites which may be stated as follows. A man who concentrates before a work of art is absorbed by it. He enters into this work of art the way legend tells of the Chinese painter when he viewed his finished painting. In contrast, the distracted mass absorbs the work of art. This is most obvious with buildings. Get this, architecture has always represented the prototype of a work of art, the reception of which is consummated by a collectivity in a state of distraction. My sort of, or everyday paraphrase of that is, most of us, most of the time, don't pay a lot of attention to the buildings around us. Our minds are elsewhere when we're out in the street. So I elaborate a kind of sort of discussion around Benjamin's concept of distraction. And then the only really original part of this text of mine is at the end of chapter 2, where I have a section which I think I'll read. It's only a couple of pages because it's my theoretical conclusion. Even though they were acquainted with one another, the ideas of these two remarkable German-Jewish 20th century thinkers, that's Arendt and Benjamin, have rarely been discussed together. To the best of my knowledge, no one has ever attempted to portray a possible relationship between the two concepts I have briefly outlined above in the thought of Arendt and Benjamin. That's action from Arendt and distraction from Benjamin. This having been said, it seems to me not only that there is a pregnant possibility of establishing such a relationship, but that the resultant hybrid would be a useful device with which to attempt to re-theorize publicness in architecture in our time. After all, Arendt framed her concept of action in opposition to that of behavior. And while she saw behavior in the first instance as a human condition of the private realm, she also saw it as having, during the modern era, moved out of that realm and thereby having contributed to the rise of the social. Of course, it is precisely in the realm of the social that Benjamin saw distraction as having so decisively manifested itself. Given these circumstances, it seems to me that it would only be a small further step to rethink the terms of these concepts slightly as they sit within the theory of their respective authors and to form a hybrid between them. To be sure, Arendt very much saw action as an opposite of behavior. Still, she acknowledged that behavior was a necessary condition of human existence. For his part, Benjamin saw distracted consciousness as at least partly a productive social phenomenon. Yet it cannot be denied that his scheme places the operational efficiency of the automobile driver, to which he refers in one of his texts, in precisely the same realm of human necessity that was for Arendt the primary locus of behavior. Further, his commendation of Bertolt Brecht's theatrical procedures makes equally apparent his ultimate acknowledgement of the important possibility of political revelation, a form of revelation that surely has much in common with Arendt's concept of action. Following this complex but fertile pattern of intellectual clues, I propose that we think of distraction and action not simply as opposites, but rather as the respective limits of a spectrum of consciousness of persons in society, or to put it another way, of bodies in proximate space. The next challenge of my argument will be to delineate the consequential gradations of experience of persons in social space across this hypothetical spectrum. As we have already noted, Benjamin's own arguments make it clear how in the conduct of our everyday lives, we are all distracted much of the time. Arendt's arguments make it clear that notwithstanding what she saw as the deadening social effects of modern society, some of us, some of the time, rise to the challenge to act. Indeed, one of the most poignant dimensions of her political theory has to do with her gratified surprise that despite its overwhelming social power in the Soviet bloc, the totalitarianism of Stalin did not prevent the historical possibility of the uprisings that led to the Hungarian Revolution of 1956, just as she was completing the manuscript of The Human Condition. If it is possible to conceive of such a spectrum of consciousness as I have proposed here, the further question arises as to how it would be possible to portray it. It is here that my interest in street photography has intersected with my interest in political theory and in public space. My proposal is to depict the spectrum of consciousness I have theorized above by means of this powerful photographic praxis. Okay. So now, how do I advance the slides? The mouse? Yes. Oh, well, this is the cover of the book. And this is the second part of the presentation tonight. How am I doing for time? Okay. Just coincidentally, I'd always been curious about street photography. Back when I was a student, there was a famous exhibition organized by Edward Steichen called The Family of Man, and I still have another of my dog-eared early publications is the catalog of Steichen's exhibit at the Museum of Modern Art. And so I've been curious about street photography as a praxis ever since. And I thought if I was gonna use this kind of theoretical apparatus, the one I've just articulated for you, in order to sort of try to kind of, present an alternative possibility about how one might talk about public space, maybe I could use the kind of vehicle of street photography to do so. Now, there's a whole section of the book about which photographers work for my purposes and which ones don't. Walker Evans is very important, Cartier-Bresson is very important, Gary Winogrand doesn't work so well, and there's a whole, but that's peripheral to the main point of the discussion tonight. So here we go. I'm going to show you a set of 6, 15, but 18 mostly street photographs, mostly classic archival street photographs, interspersed with a few news photos, but just a few. And in fact, even some of the news photos were actually used by Steichen in his exhibition. So we will start with, and by the way, you're in something brand new for those of you that have already looked at the book. Not all the photographs in the presentation show up in the book because I couldn't get permission to use them. Robert Frank turns out to be a very cranky old man, and despite all my efforts, refused to give me permission to use this photograph of his. So if any of you blabs to Robert Frank that I showed it to you tonight, I will be in trouble. This is a photograph of Robert Frank, the great He was originally Swiss, but he came to the States in the 50s, and he published, in 1956, he published this extraordinarily famous book called The Americans. And it kind of sort of captured a cross-section of American life in a way which has made him one of the most influential street photographers in the history of the discipline. So this is a street scene in New Orleans in the 1950s. Okay, my argument is this is a group of people out in the street in a state of distraction. None of them is paying any attention to anything other than simply making their way along the street. Their minds are elsewhere. They have a meeting to get to, they're late for work, their child is waiting to be fed for lunch, you name it. They're just making their way through the public world in a state of distraction. This is a more contemporary version of the same thing. This is the Bronx in New York City in the 1980s. The young man in the white shirt is obviously aware of the fact that the photograph is being taken, but as far as I can tell, he's the only person in the photograph who is. Everyone else is operating in the public world in a state of distraction, not dissimilar to that of the Robert Frank we were just looking at. Now, okay, but what I'm going to do now is I'm going to start to move along the spectrum of consciousness that I described to you before. Here we have, this is a photograph of Henri Cartier-Bresson, a street scene somewhere in rural France. In this case, if a guy on the sidewalk is showing a bunch of people a pair of snakes he's holding in his hands, this is actually going to attract some attention. And sure enough, we can see here a number of the people are intrigued enough by the sight of the snakes in his hands to pay some degree of attention to what's going on. This is also a Cartier-Bresson. And here again, a little bit of attention is clearly being paid. The older woman is clearly paying some attention to the younger woman, and we can all, each of us can try and figure out for ourselves like, what exactly is going on in this photograph. But my kind of read of it is that there's a connotation of mild disapproval of the older person in respect of the behavior of the younger one. Who knows what this is about, but something is afoot. Maybe it's that she's reading Le Figaro, which is the conservative newspaper in France. Now this is a really interesting picture for me, and it's a kind of fascinating hybrid. This is a photograph by John Sarkovsky, who not only was a wonderful photographer, but actually was the curator of photography at the Museum of Modern Art for many years. And so among other things, this is a photograph of the front entrance of a building by Louis Sullivan in Chicago. I think it's the Chicago Stock Exchange. But in this wonderful book of his, Sarkovsky, he does this kind of sort of double act where on the one hand it's architectural photography, but on the other hand it's also street photography. And so he's actually showing, the cars going by and these two guys in conversation on the street with the Sullivan building in the background. So it actually, for me, it actually captures a number of the kind of sort of terms of publicness here, in that we have a street, we have movement, we have an architectural facade, we have human bodies in proximate space, and most important of all, for the first time in my sequence, we have speech. The one guy is saying something to the other guy. And you'll remember my quote from Arendt about action and speech make their appearance anywhere. Speech is one of the kind of defining characteristics, or one of the kind of the quintessential modalities of action for Arendt. Okay, now we come to what I call sociability. This is a photograph by a much younger generation photographer. This woman is actually still alive and still taking photographs. That's her, the Asian-looking one in the white top with the yellow ribbon at her waist. She's actually the photographer. Her name is Nikki Lee, Korean-American, and she has established a photographic praxis where it's a little bit modeled on the work of Cindy Sherman, where she actually takes on social personas. She's done like strippers or Daughters of the American Revolution, and she kind of dresses herself up as one of these, and they're always female groups, one of the members of one of these groups of women, and then takes so she's always in the photograph, so she arranges it for it to be taken, but she's in it in kind of a la Cindy Sherman, along with the kind of the real versions of the social group surrounding her. And of course, so what for me is so interesting about a photograph like this one is that the subject of the photograph is the taking of the photograph. So the picture is actually about the picture being taken, and which is, it seems to me, a particularly kind of charming modality of her photographic praxis. And it also captures, and rather powerfully for me, the condition of sociability, as to use Arendt's phrase again, in sheer human togetherness. These people they're not arguing, they're not having a fight, they're not looking at anything else, they're all friends, they're together, and they're having a good time in the street, having their picture taken. Okay, now I will turn it up a notch. This is a remarkable photograph by another American photographer. This is a guy called Danny Lyons, who actually, he made his reputation taking photographs in the American South during the early years of the battles over civil rights for African Americans. And so this is a street scene somewhere in the southern United States where some student nonviolent coordinating committee interloper, who's, I guess, the guy on the left, is actually being told off by this woman in the street for not minding his own business. So here, not only do we have a group of people in the street, and not only do we have speech, but we have adversarial speech for the first time. This is not sociability we see in action here. This is resentful discord. And as if all that weren't charged enough, there's the further mystery of what in the world is going on with the guy immediately to the left. His face is immediately to the left and just above the face of the woman berating the young man in the foreground. Clearly, in some kind of evil way, that guy is enjoying the unpleasantness going on in front of him. A complex three-way kind of psychological tension in the public street. So now we're beginning to see some of the kind of psychological dimensions of public experience in the public world that are complex, not to put too fine a point on it. So, and here's another modality of complexity. This is again a Cartier-Bresson photograph, a more recent one from later in his career. And here we can see that one of the kind of delicate modalities of publicness can actually be considered to be erotic. I mean, clearly there's something going on between the guy on the bike and the young woman turning to look back at him. Proceeding onwards again, up my spectrum, across my spectrum of consciousness, we're going back in time now. This is a photograph from the 1930s by a British photographer called Bill Brandt. And the interesting thing here is that the new ingredient which is added in at this point is what I call performativity. The girl in the foreground is obviously showing off for her friends. She's clearly having a very good time doing what she's doing, and they're not having a bad time either watching her doing it. And so the idea that performance can actually be one of the modalities of self-expression in the public world is one which is actually brought to the fore in an image like this one. Then I move on again. Oh dear, who is this one? Forgotten. I should remember them all. Oh, the reason I can't remember is it's photographer unknown. Well, that's a relief. Anyway, you obviously recognize the subject, the plaza in front of what used to be the RCA building at Rockefeller Center. Anyway, the implication of this is that once performativity in public space is in play, the bodies in proximate space tend to agglomerate. So people are attracted to performance, and so the performance by persons attracts other persons, and the very presence of those other persons watching the performance attracts yet more people. So you have a kind of cumulative episode. I should say, later on in the book, I actually talk a lot about this particular space, which I think it doesn't work as well anymore because New York is paranoid about terrorism. But the streets on the sides are just regular streets. In fact, some of you who know Midtown Manhattan better than me can probably even tell me, what is it, 51st and 52nd, something like that. They're just part of the regular street grid of Manhattan, are running through at the bottom and the top of this image. And then the cross street is one which only exists inside Rockefeller Center, and it's a mid-block connection between 5th and 6th, between 51st and 52nd, or whichever those two cross streets are. And so it means that you actually have pure public space, or you originally did have anyway, pure public space with pedestrians and cars moving in both directions on three sides of this space, which then has a sectional organization which is stepped down, so it produces multiple conditions of overlook in a way which I find extraordinarily powerful. The condition of overlook in respect to public space is an incredibly powerful one sectionally, in my view. So first we had performance with the young girl dressed up in her mother's clothes. Then we had the crowd. Now we have, and this is Walker Evans again, now we have performance and the crowd combined. And that, of course, then produces what I call the ostensible rationale, because the people, the regular folks lined up as an audience to watch the band marching by are actually crowded closer together than you would normally expect in public space. It would seem to be intrusive there are only two ways you can get this close to people without it being presumptuous. One is if you're a crowd trying to see a parade. The other one is if you're in a crowded subway car, all right, where people understand that you will be closer to them than you would ordinarily assume was polite. And that, of course, then produces the possibility of the ostensible rationale. because people along the back edge here can be engaged in who knows what kind of activity just because of the conditions of experience of the majority in the scene portrayed here. Okay, finally, this is sort of like the pivot point of my sequence through across the spectrum. And this is, and it goes back to Arendt's idea of speech as one of the defining characteristics of action. And of course, action for her in the final analysis is a political praxis. So here again we have, this is Walker Evans, a photograph of his from the early 1930s, where you can see a labor organizer making an appeal to his fellow workers in respect of some sought-after project of political action. I may have a quote that goes with that. Bear with me for a moment. Nope, I don't. So this is interesting. This is from the early 1930s. And then this one, which is only about 20 years old. This is actually a photograph by the famous Canadian photographer called Jeff Wall. Jeff normally makes staged backlit Cibachromes, which sell to wealthy German collectors for hundreds of thousands of dollars. But every now and then, he does actually take just a regular street photograph, and this is one of them of a Salvation Army worker on a public street in London, England. Again, as with the worker in the previous image, here making an appeal to a passerby in the street in respect of some issue of key importance to her. So those are I can go back with, here. Sorry. So this image from the 30s by Evans, and this one from the 80s by Wall, together comprise this kind of pivot point of my kind of effort to kind of use the spectrum from distraction to action to sort of capture the moment in the middle of it where, political speech in the public world becomes palpably manifest. Okay, then of course, now that we're into political speech, we can of course, it's perfectly possible to combine political speech and the parade, which gives us a protest march, and this is one of the images in my sequence, which is not an archival street photograph, but actually just a news photograph of a gay rights march in San Francisco at the time of the peak concern about the AIDS crisis. And then here too, a very complicated image in my opinion, because of course this is related to the image which we've just seen. So here, we're moving from speech now and performance into kind of bodily action, which it's hard to know. I'm reluctant to quite call this aggression because it's clear that on the part of both the policeman and the marcher that this is in significant measure a kind of performance. He knows what he's doing, they know what they're doing. He's not actually being hurt, but a point is being made politically in both respects, but for the first time in my sequence, it actually involves the action of bodies in relation to one another. It's not, I wouldn't call this combat or war, but it's clearly a kind of bodily praxis in public terms. Turning the screws on that a bit, we come to this image, which interestingly enough is in my home city of Toronto. And here, this is not a performance. This is actually a condition of real menace, where again, the same categories of participants, protesters and police. But of course, in this case, it's not quite clear exactly what one might expect to happen, and someone could easily get hurt in these circumstances. This interestingly enough, for an American audience, this is a demonstration in Toronto protesting the results of the first Rodney King trial in Los Angeles, where the police officers were acquitted of the beating of King. And so that's how one of the few times we actually had a spillover from a kind of an American controversy into the public world in Toronto. And this is right in front of the City Hall, in the City Hall Square. Okay, so now you can see, actually now I do, let me pause for a moment for a couple of quotations, because I think it is important to capture these In this dramatic scene, we watch the performative dimension of politics and public fall away, a potentially grave manifestation of aggressive physical violence having taken its place. Just as war is the classical Arendtian companion to speech, so this physical violence is the ultimate manifestation of contestatory politics. And then, of course, that leads me to the two most violent images in my sequence. This is the first one, and this is the one. This again is a photographer unknown image, and it's actually from East Berlin in 1953. The first rebellion of young people in East Berlin against the government of the communist government of Walter Ulbricht. And in this case, you see the government has called in the Soviet tanks in order to get the insurrection under control. And so what you see here is a group of young men on the street in Berlin throwing rocks at tanks. It's very interesting if you go to Berlin nowadays. This photograph was taken not far from the intersection of Leipziger Strasse and Friedrichstrasse. And I love the Germans have such a kind of wonderful way of dealing with history. At that corner was the headquarters building of the Luftwaffe, built by the Hitler regime. And don't ask me to explain why the headquarters building for the Luftwaffe survived the war when much of the rest of central Berlin was blown to bits. But in any event, the building did survive. And it's an L-shaped building on a corner with a forecourt. And it had a heroic frieze of German airmen on its facade in a colonnade. So that's the pre-1945 version of the building. Then, of course, comes the German defeat and the occupation of Berlin by the Allied powers, eventually leading to what for a while came to be known as, the American sector, the French sector, the British sector, and the Soviet sector. And of course, with the falling of the Iron Curtain across Europe, what was initially known as the Soviet sector, then of course becomes what we then knew as East Berlin. So in the period from the late 40s all the way through to the fall of the Berlin Wall, the East Germans were in control of this building, and they built in the back of this colonnade on the front of the former headquarters of the Luftwaffe. They did a ceramic tile mural of heroic communist workers that have these Nazi airmen. They're behind the Nazi airmen, because the airmen are kind of bas relief on the building form proper, whereas the mural is up at the back of the colonnade on the upper portion of the wall. So from the creation of East Berlin all the way through to the coming down of the wall, the building is an East German governmental building with this heroic mural on the front of it. Then, of course, the wall comes down. Berlin is unified. And, of course, for those of you that have been to Berlin know that there are all these complex physical manifestations of the complex history of that city. And one of the things that the Berliners have done is that at the street edge of the forecourt of this building, there are now a series of display panels, which include these photographs of the rebellion in 1963. So you have the Nazi airmen, the happy communist workers, and the rebels in 1963 all commemorated as part of the orchestrated iconography of the front of this institutional building at the corner of Leipziger Strasse and Friedrichstrasse. So this is one of the young interpreters of Arendt is a young political theorist, well, not so young anymore, but younger than Arendt anyway, called Bonnie Honig. And this is quoting her: "For the sake of who they might become, Arendt's actors risk the dangers of the radically contingent public realm where anything can happen, where the consequences of actions are boundless, uncontrollable, irreversible, and unpredictable, where not life, but the world is at stake." And so my companion image to this one is, of course, this image, which could hardly be more famous. Apparently we understand that though a lot of people died at Tiananmen Square, this young man apparently did not. So that's my spectrum from distraction to action, using the theoretical apparatus I devised for myself, derived from the work of Arendt and Benjamin. And it concludes, just to turn the dial, the volume down a bit for the concluding image, one which is not contestatory at all, but simply very dense and complex. This is a fairly contemporary photograph by the German photographer Thomas Struth of a street scene in Wuhan, which is one of those secondary cities in China, which only has 10 million people as opposed to 30. But here so basically a street scene in Wuhan where you can see all the kind of manifest activity of publicness that one could imagine all taking place before your eyes. So that's my little experiment in political theory and street photography. And that's tonight. I'm happy to field questions or have some discussion. I think I'm okay on time. I will go on Thursday's presentation. I'll talk, I do mean Wednesday. Wednesday's presentation, I'll talk about what I call the architectural conditions of publicness. So it'll be a little less theoretical, a little more architectural. But anyway, for tonight, I'm going to stop here. And, actually, I don't have too much time left, but there is time for a bit of discussion or questions.
Thank you very much. So we will take a little bit of time for questions. I might start it off by asking you with regard to, it's a wonderful spectrum from distraction to action and back to distraction, I guess. What are we designing for? Or can we be designing specifically for one or the other? And I think we might ask you to stand at,
But that's a Wednesday question.
to stand at the microphone to respond.
Yes. Well, it's an important question, of course, but that's what Wednesday's presentation is supposed to be about. So rather than try and do it now, I'll just bounce it to then. Hopefully you'll all be interested, have been interested enough to come back for the answer.
So the answer is stay tuned.
Yeah, thank you very much. I studied at the LSE for 1 year, so Richard Sennett was one of my professors. So we read some of the Habermas, Arendt, and all this. So this, for me, this is fantastic. Somehow I feel coming back to these great moments. But somehow it raises for me also the question, if you could say a little bit more of what could be the different attitudes towards, this kind of triangle between Habermas, Arendt, Benjamin. What we take out of it for today, our relationship to the public sphere. So I don't know if you could say maybe a couple of more words. You mentioned Betsky, or so what is there? I think you mentioned also Aaron Betsky, or
Aaron Betsky, yes,
and so
I mentioned Betsky because he was published a publication, the title of which was Against Public Space. That was the logic of my reference to him, which, he was so appalled, I get, by the kind of commercialization of putatively public space that he came to the conclusion he was against it altogether. I think it's a mistaken overreaction, but I take it that was the nature of his concern.
But and do you believe that it makes a difference? Again, this question of, and it's going to be difficult not to jump to Wednesday, right? But if we have, sometimes we are wondering, because there's an element of nostalgia, obviously, seeing all these, when you start to talk about Berlin, which I'm of German origin, so but this image is from today, right? The one in China, more or less. That's what I understood.
10 years, last 10 years.
And in China, more and less, it's a society like ours. So I'm just wondering if these kind of more recent, recent examples of street photography do reveal something slightly different, or if it would make a difference if we are in Disneyland and have like thousands of people walking around, or if it's in a real public space. So this differentiation between the real public space and the private public space. I don't know.
Well, what do I think about this?
I think Charles Moore, what's...
in this respect, maybe I'm a bit of a conservative in that human nature mutates. I'm not going to deny. So I'm not saying that everything is always the same eternally. I'm not making that kind of conservative argument. But that having been said, I don't think even mutated human experience has something in common with traditional human experience. experience. So it's not identical. It's not the same in every respect, but it has some characteristics in common. So I mean, certainly you can be private in public, but then again, I think you always could do that. And I mean, you haven't mentioned the virtual, but you might along the lines of the question you're asking. But there too, I don't actually think that that I would make the argument that the virtual does not either exhaust or usurp the actual. It mutates it and it modifies it, but it doesn't make it disappear. So now, that one would have to have a much more elaborate discussion about what exactly would be implied by those statements, and that's probably more than we could do here. But so I would say that I don't think the nostalgia is as maybe I don't read the presentation as being as nostalgic as perhaps you were doing. I wondered whether I should mention the Parkland students going to see the governor. How about that? And they made a pretty good impression. I don't know how good an impression they made on the governor, but they certainly made a good impression on the North American public. And that was action. Now, whether it's enough, there's all those questions, but they say they're not going to back down. Good for them.
Well, it's interesting because I thought exactly about that, but I didn't want to ask the question. Somehow it came to my mind. So it's funny that it seemed to be so obvious. This question about how kind of protest is being shown today. It's just that somehow I think it depends how we live in this virtual environment. So I hardly do it. So somehow it seems like, we saw what I meant with nostalgia. We've seen those images, which, like a famous photographer has taken, and then they become reality for all of us because we know them, so we know what to refer to. While for today, it's difficult to have the same.
It's interesting. There was an argument that the Soviet Union was destroyed by the video cassette, because the late Stalinist communications apparatus could not control videotape. It was it was not digital, but it had sufficient decentralizing kind of capabilities that people could pass things around amongst themselves without the authorities becoming aware of it, and so it was unstoppable in the late Stalinist Soviet Union. And then, of course, we understand that in Tahrir Square, it was, early digital communication mechanisms, which was the kind of device. So I'm certainly not saying that there aren't, technological transformations that play a role in all this, but I don't think they do not supersede what we have known as publicness in its entirety. So, and the mutation is not the same as a total transformation. That's my stubborn, insistent comment. Yes.
I hope I'm not digressing. Thank you. I hope I am not digressing, but what comes to mind following your exposition and the show of a variety of acts, action, etc. What comes to mind, and it's perhaps because of my biases, are the following, are three. The Athenian agora at the time of the judgment and condemnation of Socrates. Jerusalem at the time of the washing of Pilate's hands regarding Christ's fate. And the Place de la Concorde in Paris with the enactment and reenactment of the guillotine against the nobility and even the royalty of France. Those are, and there is, these are very powerful, these scenes, even though nothing appears to be perhaps happening of that is that momentous. But I'm referring to instances where architecture, man-made space with a certain spiritual quality, place the circus to these actions. And I hope, as I said, I hope I am not digressing, because I have been taking notes about what you've been saying, and your focus on human activity in space, public in this case, is very stimulating. And I'd better pass this on. Thank you.
Oh, well, let me say, I don't disagree with your three examples. I agree with your three examples, although you know, I'm among those who think that the French Revolution just destroyed itself by its excess. So I think it's problematic. You know, it's quite interesting. Hannah Arendt holds the American Revolution in very high regard. And one of her books is even, one of her collections of essays is even titled on revolution. And so she's she's very interested in how the framers of the American Constitution relied on the Roman precedents and so on. It's a kind of, you know, absolute fascination for her. But it's interesting, you know, in the American Revolution and the French Revolution historically are often compared, and the one being the supposedly successful one, and then the later one being the one that, you know, spun out of control, which I think it surely did. But in recent years, I'm puzzled as to why historians and theorists haven't paid more attention to, there is a revolution which precedes both of those, which is arguably at least as important as either of them. And that's the so-called Glorious Revolution in Britain in the 17th century, with the beheading of King Charles. And if you're talking about you know, positive long-term historical effects, the Glorious Revolution in Britain is arguably even more successful than either the American or the French. So it's just a paradox of history that it doesn't get nearly the same degree of historical scrutiny as the other two do. But and of course, you know, to come back to Habermas for a moment, obviously, you know, that's the aftermath of the Glorious Revolution in Britain actually leads to the construction of what we now know as the bourgeois citizen, in the later 17th and 18th century. So it's of huge historical importance. But anyway, to come back to your point, it was not a digression. I mean, it was consistent with the argument I was presenting, what you said. Agreed.
Well, thank you very much. We'll stick around for a little bit of conversation before we take Mr. Baird to dinner. Come back Wednesday when you'll hear the answer to my question.
Yes. No more street photographs, but more illustrations. I promise.
Thank you again.